What is up, good people? It is Jahid Wilson, aka Heedy the Scribe, live from this funky, fresh fit because I went to the gym, I guess, Fit Friday. I hope all of you are doing well. I hope you've been taking care of yourselves, pouring into your own cup, drinking enough water because I know a lot of y'all be drinking like energy drinks and like coffee instead of water and shit. But girlies, I'm talking to you especially. Been drinking your water, been eating food, been being active, been breathing, been doing things you enjoy. So today is gonna be more of like a writing centered kind of video topic, and it's gonna deal with a question that was crispy that I get a lot, and that is how do I write diverse characters? And I wanted to do a video on this because I think it's a great question and interesting topic that definitely deserves some exploration. So there's so much to say here. Usually, when I get this question, it's more often than not people who are non-black, usually white, asking how they can write black characters. Just kind of use that for, just kind of keep that in the back of your mind for understanding what the inspiration for this video was. So to kind of start, when you are writing a character with whom you do not share a ethnic, cultural, or religious background, I think the first place you want to kind of start and ask yourself is, does this story take place in our world? And the reason why I say you start there is because if you are writing like a fictionalized or a fiction story, magical realism, what have you, but it's set within the parameters of the world we live in, there are still rules you kind of have to abide by. You don't have necessarily the liberty of kind of doing whatever you want like you would be able to in a completely fantastical setting, right? There are of course some exceptions to this rule, and like for example Pretty by Keith F. Miller. One thing Keith did is his story is set in early 2000s Savannah. However, he wrote a world where things like homophobia and transphobia do not exist, and people were free to love whom and who they loved without labels or without judgment. Now, if you are being very intentional, you can play with the rules of the world in that aspect, but you will still need to give the reader something that allows them to connect to this world and recognize it as their own and recognize it as familiar. Using Pretty as that same example, one thing Keith did is a story follows an all black cast who are in the hood. They have a lot of hood black experiences. They still have a lot of experiences as black people navigating and moving through the world. So even though homophobia and transphobia, which are honestly rooted in misogyny, even though that doesn't exist, that core element of the black experience still does. Does that make sense? So that kind of being said and segueing into my next point, what I will ask is, if you are seeking to write a character with whom you don't share their background or a particular aspect of their background, what is the connection point? You need to kind of ask yourself, what is your proximity to this character, and is there any intersectionality? So you're like, okay, that's dope. What does that mean though? So what I mean when I say that is, for example, I have a main character in my current work in progress or my finished book, A Poor Man's Prose. His name is Calder. Calder is Afro Dominican, right? Calder's Afro Dominican. He's dark skinned. He grew up in the States he moved around a lot, and he grew up basically having the black experience. So for me, when I sat down to write Calder, there were a lot of points of connection for us because again, I'm a man, he's a man. I'm straight, he's straight. We both grew up in America as black men. We both have that. We both had the black experience. We both had a two-parent household. You see what I mean? There's so many ways in which I'm able to kind of connect with him, that I'm able to write him in a way that's authentic and it's honest and it's respectful. Also because he's a fictionalized version of me. Now, however, there are aspects of him that I just don't know about, and that being the Dominican part. Well, to my knowledge, I am not Dominican. I don't know where my family comes from. I blame slavery for that. But I'm not Dominican, right? So fortunately, my girlfriend is Afro Dominican. Her family is from DR. Her grandparents and her biological father were all born there. And one of her grandmothers immigrated here, the other still lives there. So when it comes to things like the Spanish, for example, or like the specific style of Dominican Spanish, because it's very slangy, very distinct to the region. And when it came to like foods that they would eat and kind of everything that has to do with Dominican culture, I asked her about it. However, this wasn't too large a hurdle for me to leap because I was already so close to Calder's lived experiences that it was easier for me to kind of fill in the gaps and be like, okay, cool. In addition to hip hop, he grew up listening to bachata and reggaeton, right? And so he grew up eating tostones and maduros and like tresos golpes, right? Stuff like that. And he speaks Spanish. He's completely fluent in Spanish. His grandmother doesn't speak English. So those were those little things I was able to fill in the gaps. And it wasn't that hard for me to do because I was not so far removed from the character that it would be not impossible, but immensely difficult for me to write about his experiences. Does that make sense? So let's think of this in a different angle, in a different way. Imagine you have a straight white man who wants to write about a black lesbian. This is going to be very difficult because there's no intersectionality there. He's white, she's black, that's an X. He's straight, she's lesbian, that's an X. He's a man, she's a woman, that's an X. You do not know enough about this character to be able to write about her experiences or from her point of view. You know what I mean? Like, and it's a really important question that you have to ask yourself is if you're interested in exploring that route, why? It's really important to kind of interrogate that. Why do I feel like I am the person who should write about this voice from this point of view? And is there a world where I'm potentially taking away from the voice of someone who does belong to this community, right? Is it better for me to just kind of stay silent or revisit this or explore ways in which I could kind of change the character into something that's a little bit closer to my own experience? Now, of course, I'm not saying you have to write exclusively what you know, because if that's what we did, we wouldn't have any fantasy stories, right? But here's the thing with fantasy. Fantasy has no basis for comparison. Fantasy is us largely making shit up or taking inspiration from like the various mythologies across the world, right? But again, there's nothing definitive about it. None of us can say your description of how to ride a dragon is accurate or inaccurate because none of us ever done that shit before. But when you are basing something off of a real life culture or group of people or experiences that folks have, you need to be very close to the thing that you are writing or willing to immerse yourself in deep research to be able to portray it accurately and respectfully. Does that make sense? And even if you are writing fantasy, you still need to have sensitivity readers to make sure you don't have any subconscious implicit biases that you're not aware of. For example, Sarah J. Maas in the Court of Thorns and Roses series, one thing that she did is I think the Illyrians, I don't know how to say it. It's been years since I read those books. But when she described the darker skinned race of people, they were described as barbarians. So even though that's a fantasy setting, that's an example of some subconscious bigotry and racism coming out in the way you choose to portray the brown people in your story. So you don't get a free pass just because you're writing something in a fantasy setting. You still need sensitivity readers to make sure you're doing your characters in the world justice. Does that make sense? So, but I will say though, when it comes to fantasy, you do have a bit more room to play because it's a little bit differently. It's a little bit different if you're writing a character who's a part of the LGBTQIA plus community in Westeros, as opposed to what it's like growing up gay in the deep south in America. You see what I mean? There are real people who have lived that experience, who are living that experience, who would be able to tell that story far better than someone who isn't can, or who's not a part of that community can. Whereas Westeros, ain't none of us from there. Don't nobody know nobody from no damn Westeros. Is made up, right? So you have room to play. And also in these fantasy worlds, things like racism and homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, like anything like that, xenophobia, all the phobias, they only exist if you want them to. So it's very important to again interrogate this reasoning of like, okay, I want this thing to exist. Why? Because having brown people in a fantasy setting is completely fine as long as you do it respectfully. Because our understanding and context and the historical context of racism does not exist in this world. So if you have a character who's dark skinned, they can just be dark skinned, and that's not like a thing that they have to navigate, unless, of course, it's a thing you make them navigate, which, again, be very careful if you're choosing to do that. Be very intentional, right? So, whew, I get excited. I love this kind of stuff. I forgot what I was going to say next. Oh, Lord, I'm going to have to edit the fuck out of this. But I hope I'm making sense. And I think another really important thing to understand as well is fictional setting, like a story based in this world, or a story based out of it, or a story based in between it doesn't matter. The key to writing diverse characters is understanding we are people outside of one particular defining trait. Like, I'm not just a black man. I'm not just a melanated person. I'm someone who loves anime. I love martial arts. I love to watch UFC. I love jujitsu. I love basketball. I'm vegan. I love to cook. I love to go on walks. I love to do yoga. There is so much to me outside of just being a melanated person. Now, of course, some of my separate identities intersect with my blackness because, again, I'm a blurred. I'm a black nerd. That's like a whole community and thing. Like, we're our own little ecosystem. You know what I mean? But like the things that I enjoy, like being vegan or yoga, or like I enjoy audiobooks and to read on my Kindle and to read by hand. And I love being outside and being near the water because I'm a Pisces. Those are all little facets of who I am. Like, I'm not just black. That isn't the extent of who I am. It's not every single conversation you have with me. It's blackety black, 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 McBlackerson. Again, that's a core and integral part of who I am, but that's not all of who I am. And what happens with these characters a lot is you have folks who are so concerned about, right, how do I write a good gay character? How do I write a good black character, or Asian or Hispanic, whatever, that that's all they focus on, and they like whittle down what could otherwise be a really interesting and compelling character to their queerness or to their ethnicity. And it's like, yo, we are people outside of that. I am not like they You have to remember, they are interesting people and they are characters who also happen to be black or queer or what have you. If all I take away from your character at the end of reading this book is their sexual orientation or their ethnicity, then you did not write a memorable or a good character. I'll go as far as to say that. And now, I have seen this question pop up, and I just kind of want to address it right quick. And the question was like, okay, cool. I grew up in the hood. Does that mean I can write black characters? No, because hood culture is not the same as black culture. Hood culture intersects with black culture, but hood culture does not encompass the entirety of the black experience. And even if you grew up in the hood, you still grew up in the hood, white or something that wasn't black. That's a different experience. So you could write a book about what it's like to be from the hood and the what kind of goes in with that, but you can't write about what it means to be a brown person living in these spaces if you are not a brown person operating and existing within these spaces. You know what I mean? So, because again, there's black people who grew up in the suburbs. There's black people like myself who are hood adjacent. And hood adjacent means you didn't grow up in the hood, but you had a lot of loved ones, friends, family, etc., who lived in the hood. So you were there a lot, right? There's so many different ways that we are able to exist. And again, one thing I think we kind of forget a lot as well is that all African Americans are black people, but not all black people are African Americans. You can have, again, someone like Afro Dominicans. You can have Africans who have immigrated from Africa. Like, there's so many different facets to black culture. You can't like compartmentalize it and kind of like define it as, oh yeah, hood culture. Does that make sense? So I know I'm kind of rambling here. I wanted to try to give some insight into the process of creating diverse characters. And all this is to say is, remember that they are unique people with unique experiences, and they have identities and passions and hopes and fears and joys outside of these singular pieces of their identity. So explore those, make them multifaceted, make them interesting, make them detailed, make them feel real and leap off the page. You know what I'm saying? Make them a person who I never forget about and I always want to keep reading. Hopefully this was helpful. I know I rambled a little bit, But hopefully, I got some value from this. And if you want more content like this, just let me know. But that's all I got to say for today. So, yeah, peace out, y'all.